If you'd like to take the Bible on the shelf in front of you and turn to page 785. Our reading comes from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 25. That's on page 785. It's headed 70 Years of Captivity. The word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So Jeremiah the prophet said to all the people of Judah and to all those living in Jerusalem, for 23 years from the 13th year of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, until this very day, the word of the Lord has come to me, and I have spoken to you again and again, but you have not listened. And though the Lord has sent all his servants, the prophets, to you again and again, you have not listened or paid any attention. They said, turn now each of you from your evil ways and your evil practices, and you can stay in the land the Lord gave to you and your ancestors forever and ever. Do not follow other gods to serve and worship them. Do not arouse my anger with what your hands have made. Then I will not harm you. But you did not listen to me, declares the Lord, and you have aroused my anger with what your hands have made, and you have brought harm to yourselves. Therefore the Lord Almighty says this, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord. And I will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all surrounding nations. I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and scorn and an everlasting ruin. I will banish from them the sounds of joy and gladness, the voices of bride and bridegroom, the sound of millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the Lord, and will make it desolate forever. I will bring on that land all the things I have spoken against it, all that are written in this book and prophesied by Jeremiah against all the nations. They themselves will be enslaved by many nations and great kings. I will repay them according to their deeds and the work of their hands. Amen.
Thank you very much, Derek. It'd be great if you could keep Jeremiah 25 open in front of you. We're going to be exploring that together. Just before we do, let me just mention this bargain book that we've got on the bookstall by Keith and Kristen Getty, many of whose songs we often sing here. If you want to know what stands behind their vision, you can buy this book for £1.49, reduced from £9.99. Is that a bargain or is that a bargain? Perfect Christmas present. The reason it's so cheap is there is a tiny printing error on the back cover. Other than that, it's pristine. So really recommend that you get hold of that. Might even make a nice Christmas present for somebody that looks a bit more generous than it actually is, but never mind. I don't think I will ever forget Mother's Day earlier this year, 2017. I was with a team, a number of them are here this morning, in a town on the southern part of the coast of Lebanon, and we were looking at the work of a fabulous charity there called Heart for Lebanon. And as we arrived, we were greeted by this fellow here, Milad, who was one of the most wonderfully hyper kind of characters I've ever met in all my life. And he led us into a room where he gave us a kind of high-paced, high-intensity briefing for a few minutes, and then led us out into another room where there were maybe 40 or 50 Syrian refugee children who were making their Mother's Day presentation to their mums. At the end of the presentation, they sang this haunting song that I think I'll never forget. This is the translation of some of the words. My land is at war and it's burnt down. They stole my childhood. Where are the birds that are flying, the sun that is lighting our land? O people, listen. My land is on fire. It's burnt down. They stole our freedom. Bring me back my peace. Bring me back my childhood. Well, Milad, this tough guy who'd greeted us, he was actually from a paramilitary background himself. But he stood in the back row with those children singing, and his face was awash with tears, and we were weeping with him as well. It was one of those unforgettable moments, because being forced from your home and away into destitute poverty is surely one of the most traumatic of human experiences. It's one of the reasons why I'm rather thrilled that we're supporting Heart for Lebanon as part of our Christmas appeal this year. And I have to say, having seen their work, I hope that this is perhaps our best ever Christmas appeal. It's an incredibly worthy cause. But this kind of experience of a community snatched from their homeland and taken off into captivity is the experience that dominates the final part of the Old Testament story that we've been looking at over the last 5 or 6 weeks. It's the story of exile, the exile of the people of God from the land that he had given them, from the blessing that he had intended for them. And though it is a story of history, it is more than that as well. It's also a very powerful metaphor of perhaps our deepest problem as human beings, because we were made to have a home, and we were made for that home fundamentally to be with God himself, in relationship with him. But we too are exiled from him because of all of the bad stuff that we've let into our lives. And the Bible story that we've been journeying through together is essentially the good news of how we can be brought back home to God through what he's done for us in Jesus Christ, his Son. Let's pick up the story from where we were last week. We were really at the high point of the whole of the Old Testament story with those kings, David a couple of weeks ago and Solomon last week, where the nation of Israel was at its full strength. God's people, you remember our 3 things: God's people, God's blessing, God's place, where God's people are now a strong nation with strong kings. They're secure in the land, the place that God had given them, with God's own dwelling place, the temple at the heart of the land. And the nations are looking in and thinking, wow, God has really blessed them. Remember the Queen of Sheba? We saw her last week coming and talking to Solomon, and so impressed with all that God had done in the land and blessed his people. God's people in his place, experiencing his blessing, and that overflowing to the nations. Wonderful. So how do we get from those glory days of David and Solomon to the disaster of exile? Well, hopefully this diagram will help us. We saw last week Solomon didn't finish well, and James already reminded us about that. And God warned him that after his death, trouble was coming as a result. The kingdom would be divided into 2 kingdoms, and that's exactly what happens. 10 of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel broke away under a guy called Jeroboam, who was a previous ally of Solomon, but sort of turned rebel. So he had 10 of the tribes up in the north, and that left just 2 tribes for Solomon's son Rehoboam, who succeeded him as king. The kingdom is split, and both kingdoms now are on this long-term journey to rebellion and disaster, and ultimately to exile. The northern kingdom up in the north, usually called Israel with the 10 tribes, that lasted just over 2 centuries after Solomon's death, when it was conquered by Assyria and the people were taken off to exile there. The southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, well, that lasted a little bit longer, and that's the one we're going to focus on this morning. I want you to roll forward 117 years from the end of the northern kingdom and the exile to Assyria. We go down south to Jerusalem into the southern kingdom, 117 years later, and we're at chapter 25 of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is there in Jerusalem, the capital city of the southern kingdom, but Jeremiah is known to history as the weeping prophet, because his message is that just as disaster came to the northern kingdom of Israel, so disaster is about to come to the southern kingdom of Judah as well. Let's look at what happened. Verses 1 to 6, it's all about strong words. And you know, I have to say, I'm generally not a fan of strong words. Not very long ago, I had a conversation with somebody where I was stronger than I should have been. And goodness me, do I wish I hadn't been. Strong words often unravel in unhelpful ways. Generally, they add to our problems, they don't solve them. And actually, there's biblical wisdom for this, isn't there? James 1:19, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger doesn't produce the righteousness which God desires. Strong words are often destructive, but we do all know, nonetheless, that there is a place for strong words. A parent sees their toddler crawling towards a fire, and the strong word of warning can be the lifesaver that they need. Well, according to Jeremiah, God had been speaking many strong words to his people via the prophets, including Jeremiah himself. We saw this earlier, didn't we, with all those warning signs that Jane put up on the screen. God has sent this succession of prophets. A prophet is just someone who receives and speaks the word of God. That's all a prophet is. And in fact, the writings of the prophets make up about a quarter of the Old Testament. They're a big part of this story. And through those prophets, God has been speaking strong words to his people over generations. And Jeremiah says here in verse 3, look, for 23 painful years now, I've been receiving the word of the Lord for you, and I've told you faithfully what he said, and I've earned no popularity for myself for it. Not only so, I'm just one in a long line of prophets. They've warned you one after the other, that you can't claim to know and love God and then ignore what he says. It just won't wash. Strong words. Disaster will come if you don't listen. Just have a look at verses 4 to 6. The Lord has sent all his servants, the prophets, to you again and again, and you have not listened or paid attention. They said, turn now, each of you, from your evil ways and your evil practices, and you can stay in the land the Lord gave to you and your ancestors forever and ever. Do not follow other gods to serve and worship them. Do not arouse my anger with what your hands have made. Then I will not harm you. That's what the message of the prophets has been. Notice what's at stake is whether or not they will stay in the land. And God is challenging both the disobedience of their lives, verse 5, and the disloyalty of their hearts as they're worshipping other gods in his place. Always important to understand with the prophets that their message is not new. All that they are doing is applying what God had already said generations before through Moses. You can read about it in the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where all this was spelt out, that if God's people obeyed him and listened to his voice and nurtured their relationship with him, they would live in the land forever. But if they didn't, he would move in judgment against them and they would be exiled from the land. And what the prophets are doing is saying, look all around you. Can't you see? God has warned you. It's going to happen. God doesn't give idle threats. Now, if their message is accepted, the exile will not happen. But, as we all know, strong words are often met with closed ears. I spotted this week on the Huffington Post website some 7 top questions to ask yourself when a child isn't listening to what you say. Do you want them? Top 7? I've suddenly seen some very attentive-looking parents around here. Here are the questions, but they're to ask yourself, okay? Number 1, how full is their attachment tank? Not sure what that means, but you can figure. Number 2, is she compromised? That is, distracted because her basic physical needs are not met. She's hungry. Are your expectations of her unreasonable? Is she dealing with intense emotions? Was she surprised by what you said? Did it come out of the blue? Are you using clear instructions? Are you being friendly? I don't know why they think those are only useful for girl kids who don't listen. Alison's found they're pretty useful for husbands as well. But the point is that the ears of God's people hear, are firmly closed to the words that he's speaking to them through the prophets. Verse 4 again. Though God has sent you all his servants, the prophets, to you again and again, you have not listened or paid any attention. Interesting that he says both, isn't it? There is a difference between hearing someone and paying attention to someone. And they have done neither. Now, God isn't like the kind of parents who is always breathing out threats against their children but doesn't follow them through. Bad idea, parents, okay? We've all done it, but bad idea. God isn't like that. And Jeremiah knows that God isn't like that. And he realizes that with Nebuchadnezzar coming to the throne in Babylon, the time of warning is coming to an end, and the time of judgment is coming near. Verse 1, the word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And he's going to appear again in the story in a few moments' time. Jeremiah knows that God has spoken strong words. Jeremiah knows that the people have not listened. They've closed their ears. And Jeremiah perceives that the time of disaster is near. These people whom God had rescued from their captivity in Egypt are going to return to captivity, but in Babylon. In other words, we're looking at the unraveling of freedom. One of the saddest things to see as a pastor, actually, is when you see someone press the self-destruct button and nothing you can do or say will dissuade them from doing it. The thing that drives it is usually something very superficially attractive. It might be the high of a drug fix. It might be a sexual fling. It might be another drink. It might be a promotion that you can see is going to be destructive. It can be lots of different things, but you can sort of see it's not going to end well. But the ears are closed, and the self-destruct button is at hand. And the thing that promised such fun and freedom gradually tightens its grip around the person until one day they wake up and they know that they've become its slave. And it's taken everything from them. A family is destroyed, a body is ruined, sometimes even a life is ended. And it really hurts. The unraveling of freedom. The return to slavery. And that's what's about to happen in Judah. Have a look again at verses 8 to 11. The Lord Almighty says, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, you see he's back again, king of Babylon, declares the Lord. And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations. I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and scorn and everlasting ruin. I will banish them from the sounds of joy and gladness, the voices of bride and bridegroom, the sound of millstones and the light of the lamp. The whole country will become a desolate wasteland. These nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. Freedom unraveling. Harrowing to read. Far worse, of course, to experience. And this is exactly what happened just a few years later, 586 BC. Jerusalem was besieged, the city was destroyed, the temple was burnt to the ground, many were slaughtered, and the survivors were exiled from their homeland, far away to captivity in Babylon. You can read about it in 2 Chronicles 36. Isn't it tragic? This nation whom God had made to find their home with him is now alienated from him because of their rebellion and sin. May I say to you, with all seriousness, God does not make idle threats. He made us for himself, but he has also given us the freedom to push him away. And if we close our ears to his voice and push him out of our lives, there will come a moment when the opportunity to come back is finished. And we find ourselves in the darkness forever. God doesn't make idle threats. Back to the story. God's people are destroyed. Verse 9. God's blessing is removed. Verse 10. I'll banish from them the sounds of joy and gladness, the voice of bride and bridegroom, because they've broken that relationship with him. Verse 11, God's place, God's land is devastated. Even the temple, the place of his presence, which they believed would stand forever, God would never let that go. Even the temple razed to the ground and its gates burned with fire. But of course it does raise a big problem, doesn't it? Because remember, we're not just looking at a little bit of the story during these weeks. We're looking at the whole of the story. And God had made these promises to Abraham. These promises of a people who would come from him, who would live in the land he gave them, who would live under his blessing. And now it looks as if those promises have completely unraveled. So does God not keep his promises after all? Well, there is just a glimmer of hope, isn't there? Did you notice at the end of verse 11, they will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. This thing is going to be awful, but it isn't going to last forever. There is a promise of restoration. I've told you Lynette's story before here. She's with us this morning. Great to have you here, Lynette. But her own journey from serial abuse and rejection to new life and freedom in Jesus. Actually, you can read her story in a book on the bookstall. Ask them about it later. When I first got to know Lynette, she was always on the move. She didn't stay anywhere too long. And so becoming a Christian and finding a real community where she began to feel involved and loved, it was fantastic for Lynette. I checked this out with her yesterday. Okay, so it's all right. But soon after she became a Christian, Lynette went to India to work there for a while. And it was an interesting time, positive in many ways, but stretching and difficult in some ways too. And she decided that she'd come back. But I'll always remember what she said about her decision to come back. It was something like this. She said, I realized that my real family, where I really belong now, was back here in Southampton in the church at Above Bar. My heart just leapt when I heard Lynette say that. And I said to myself, wow, God has really restored this wonderful woman. He's given her a new family. He's given her a home. And he's brought her back to that home. We love having you as part of the family, Lynette. And that's exactly what God had promised to do for Judah, this southern kingdom of his people. There were going to be two stages to it. First, he would deal with Babylon, who had destroyed them. Verse 12, when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the Lord. And I will make it desolate forever. So their enemy is going to be destroyed. But that's only part of the story. God is also going to bring them back to the land. Let me just read to you from a few chapters later, verses 10 to 14 of Jeremiah 29. This is what the Lord says. When the 70 years, that same period, are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come to me and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I'll bring you back from captivity. I'll gather you from all the nations and places where I banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Notice it's the restoration of a people, it's the restoration of a land, bringing them back home, but it's also the restoration of a relationship. You will seek me and you will find me, and I'll listen to you again. The land, the people, the blessing restored. That's the wonderful promise. And that tells us that there is something to hold on to when everything goes wrong. And it's the promises of God, which don't fail. Oh, how hard it must have been for those 70 years in exile still to hang on to the promises of God. How often people must have thought, after all these years, there is no hope. Sometimes God's care, God's plan, it's like a slow burner. It doesn't work on our time scale. But God's promises do not fail. And after the 70 years, he's going to bring them back and restore them. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament tell the story of how that happened, how the people returned from their exile, rebuilt their temple, repaired their city, and recommitted themselves to God. We've been looking at the story of Nehemiah in our evening services over the summer, so you can look at those sermons online if you want to. But there's an odd twist. This is a kind of happy ending after a tragic story, isn't it? But it isn't quite as tidy as it looks, because the story at the end of the book of Nehemiah, which is really the end of the Old Testament, the story kind of fizzles out in the most unsatisfying way. Because yes, they did rebuild the temple, but the people who rebuilt it, who had any memory of the old one, wept when they saw it, because it was tiny in comparison with the temple that had been there before. And actually, Nehemiah was finding that the people weren't looking after the temple anyway. And they were still only half-hearted in their love for God. And actually, if you track the history between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, for those centuries, there were very few periods of time where Israel lived as a free nation. Almost always, they were under the occupation of other foreign empires. So in a deep sense, the exile had still not ended. Yes, they were back in the land after the 70 years. Yes, God fulfilled his promises, but there was so much that was still to be fulfilled. The nation wasn't truly restored. And that's how the Old Testament finishes. To be honest, it's all a bit underwhelming. Finishes kind of with a whimper, really. I remember back in 2002, I got a new mobile phone. There it is, Nokia 6210. How about that? It was bigger than I was used to, bit of a brick. But you could use it to take a few grainy pictures. You could send texts on it. I think I did, 5 or 10 a month or something. And the great thing about it was it had this clunky cable that would connect it to my laptop so that I could do emails and internet on the go. As long as I had many, many spare hours, because it was so slow. It was just unbelievable. Oh, and you could make phone calls on it as well. Just, you forget that sometimes. Now, it was all I knew, and I was fairly pleased with my phone. But it was kind of frustrating too. Here was a device that opened a window onto a connected world where photos, emails, internet, speech, music could all be woven seamlessly together in the palm of my hand. It sort of promised that, but it was slow, it was clunky, the photos were rubbish. Basically, it promised an iPhone, but it was really just a Nokia. And an old clunky one at that. Do you know that's a bit what the Old Testament ends like? There's this window that Nokias are very good. Sorry, that there are some very good Nokias you can buy now. I just better say that. But you get to the end of the Old Testament, and this window has opened up onto a wonderful promise of restoration, but the reality doesn't match up. Do you know, actually the problem is even deeper than that, because some of the prophets saw an even bigger vision of what this great homecoming was going to look like. Isaiah especially saw that the homecoming that God had in mind wasn't just about bringing one nation back home. It was going to be about gathering a people from all the nations back to himself. Isaiah also saw that God didn't want to just heal one land in the Middle East there. He actually had a plan to renew the whole of creation, and that God didn't have a plan just to restore the blessings that had come through Moses and through the law, but to do something entirely new and bring a new kind of blessing by the Holy Spirit, who would come and live in us and change our hearts from the inside out. Isaiah had seen all that. But in the Old Testament, all it was promise. It wasn't delivery or fulfillment. And if that's how it had remained, to be honest, the Old Testament would be a book that offered very little concrete help to non-Jewish people like me and many of us here this morning. But that is to fundamentally miss the point of the Old Testament. It's intended to be an unfinished story, a book without its final chapter, a drama without its final act. Because the Old Testament is meant to leave us on the edge of our seats waiting. That's what it's there for. Waiting for something awesome, for great promises still to be fulfilled, waiting for someone awesome through whom those promises would reach their fulfillment. Someone who could bring you and me back from our exile into the arms of God to find our true home in him. His name is Jesus Christ, and he stands at the center of the whole story. And he came to bring hope to the whole world. The Syrian children exiled to Lebanon, the Rohingya Muslims exiled to Bangladesh, ordinary people like me and you who long for answers, long for love, who long to know that we really matter to God and can find our rest and peace in him. And he came not to shout rules at us from the sky, ridiculous ideas about pulling ourselves up by our own bootlaces to make ourselves good enough for God. It's never going to happen. Just forget it. No, that's not what he came to do. He came instead to give his life to pay the penalty for all the bad stuff in our lives, so that it's all dealt with, the barrier removed, and we are free to come home to the God who made us for himself. As we read in the book of 1 Peter, Christ suffered, he died once for sins, for all the bad stuff. The righteous one for the unrighteous, to bring you to God, so you can find your home in him. Have you asked him to do that for you? Have you come back home to God through Jesus Christ? Or are your ears closed to his words? Too strong for you. You won't listen. Well, over the next few weeks, we're going to find out more about Jesus. But if you can't wait for next week to come home to God through Jesus Christ, and it's not a very good idea to wait till next week, to be honest, just come find me down the front at the end, and I'd love to give you a booklet that will help you. Let's pray together. Lord Jesus, thank you so much that you came in fulfillment of all these years of promise, and you came to bring us home to the Father. Please help each of us here this morning, wherever we may be with you, to have our ears open to your voice, to heed your warnings, and to open our lives to your presence and your direction. Help us to come near to God through Jesus and find our rest and peace and joy in him. Amen. We're going to sing.